challenge. We are going to give it a couple of minutes for some people to come into the room, so please bear with us with a couple of minutes. Bienvenidas a las personas a la sesión del día de hoy.
Welcome everyone to today's session. We have interpretation. Please look for the globe and you will find the interpretation option there to Spanish.
Please make sure to look for the sign of the globe, which you may find in the top or the bottom of your screen. It's like a globe, and there you can click on and choose the language that you feel most comfortable in. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to come into the room to begin the presentation. Thank you for your patience. If while you're waiting, you want to say hi on the chat, as we are already seeing people doing and telling us from where they're coming, that would be wonderful. Please tell us where you're joining us from. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Let's begin this session. My name is Elena Olea, and I work at Alianza Americas. And Alianza Americas is one of the co-conveners of the People's Migration Challenge. We're very proud and very happy with the opportunity that this space brings for dialogue and discussion about setting a migrants agenda based on what migrants and their organizations are the work they're doing on the ground. So I'm really happy to be in this extraordinary session today, as I mentioned. The People's Migration Challenge decided to convene this extraordinary session because we believe that it would be a good idea to share more widely the work that is being advanced in the context of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Some of you may be more familiar with this space, may understand better a little bit about its history and about the opportunities that it has created and brought to those that have engaged with it in the past. Some of you may not be familiar with the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Some of you may have actually attended some of the sessions. And so you may have very pertinent questions in terms of what your experience has been on the past. To have this conversation today, we have asked some members from civil society who participated in the first round tables to discuss some of the topics to come and join us here today to share more widely the actual discussion and some of the views that they presented there, trying to bring to the table the voices and perspectives from civil society. But to understand better this whole process and the role of civil society in it, I would like to begin by inviting to the floor Colin Raja. Mr. Colin Raja is the coordinator of the GFMD Civil Society Mechanism, and he's also the coordinator of the Civil Society Action Committee. Colin joins us from San Francisco, California, so I want to acknowledge his very early in the day participation today and all of the experience that he brings to the table to this discussion. Colin, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. And what would you like to share with the audience today?
Thank you very much, Helena, and thank you for the warm welcome. I also wanted to suggest that my colleague also with the Civil Society Mechanism and Civil Society Action Committee, OMU, will be joining me in this brief presentation about the GFMD as we will be sharing some slides. First of all, to say that the Civil Society Mechanism is the body that kind of coordinates civil society participation and engagement in the Global Forum on Migration and Development. This has been mandated since 2011 during the Swiss chairmanship, where for years we in civil society had insisted that civil society engagement should be self-organized by civil society itself. And finally, in 2011, after about 5 years of the Global Forum, the chairmanship under Switzerland agreed and handed over the coordination of civil society engagement to us. We are guided and we are directed by an international steering committee. All of the co-organizers of PMC are members of that international steering committee, so you are well placed here by everyone who is really leading the civil society engagement and participation in the GFMD. We are a small coordinating office. We are just basically the secretariat that undertakes what the international steering committee directs and kind of guides us through this year. For this year, we are under the chairmanship of France. Some of you may have heard that originally it was both France and Senegal. It was both a co-chairmanship and would be led by 2 countries. However, after some changes in the government in Senegal, Senegal is no longer co-chairing it, but certainly it is still being led by France. And of course, the GFMD has its own member states that is called the Friends of the Forum. That is the body of the GFMD that runs and directs the GFMD. But really, under the chairmanship of France, France leads a lot of it this year. Under France's chairmanship, it has set 6 thematic priorities for this GFMD. The first, as you can see, almost showing here, is the impact of climate change on human mobility. And we don't even name it number 1. We have an exclamation for climate change, because climate change is also the overall overarching theme for this chairmanship. Climate change is ultimately extremely important, and it's cross-cutting in many different areas as well. So climate change is the first theme. The second theme is around rights and migration. Just a quick comment about this. In the early days of the GFMD, we were told, and I'm sure William and many others here from the original days participating in the original GFMDs will remember that we were told with no uncertainty that we could not even mention human rights, that human rights did not belong in the discussion in GFMD. And we in civil society insisted that was not true, that human rights should be and must be front and center in the GFMD. And we consistently pushed that year after year after year. In fact, in parallel events that we organized, we called it the People's Global Action on Migration, Development, and human rights. So we insisted that it should be even in the title of things that we organize. And now we have human rights as one of the themes. It's no longer taboo to talk about human rights. You'll see in the last few GFMDs, human rights is often mentioned, and now it's one of the themes. So we think that is our achievement in civil society in consistently pushing that. The third theme of this GFMD is diasporas and the contribution that diasporas bring, both in terms of culture as well as economic and social development, both in receiving countries and in both in destination countries, but also in countries of origin. And that's a very interesting discussion. Here are the other French translations of this, but let's just jump down to number 4. Number 4 is around labor migration. This is a carryover theme from the last GFMD. The last GFMD, many of you might remember, was under the chairmanship of the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and labor was the overarching theme, particularly for that region, was extremely important. So we're continuing that conversation from there and continuing that agenda and moving that agenda forward. The fifth theme is around the perception of migration in narratives, culture, and other rational discourses. This is also a standing and ongoing working group in the GFMD. The issue around changing narratives and cultural contributions of migrants in migration is within perceptions of the public is something that's very important in the GFMD discussion. And so now it's also one of the roundtable themes as well. And finally, the last thematic priority is around multi-level governance, bringing together stakeholders for improved migration management. This is something that we've also argued for many years. And also now the new mayors, not so new anymore, it's about 4 years old, but the mayors mechanism of the GFMD has been saying that local government also plays an important role in governance. We are also saying, and civil society saying, yes, that's true. Also, local government is very important. We have been saying that, we have been arguing that, but also civil society and other stakeholders play a role in governance. So these are really critical discussions, and our thematic leads will walk you through that in a second. I just want to mention a few more things about this. We just scroll down that in our discussions early in the year, in fact, and since last year, in our International Steering Committee and our strategy group that guides how we are engaging in this year's GFMD, we have said that it's ultimately important that civil society organizes its own engagement, its own process, its own ways of highlighting what are key and important to us. And this PMC discussion is extremely important and has been important as part of that. So one of the things we also started organizing was our own calendar, in not just the calendar of the official GFMD events, but our own civil society calendar of things that we are organizing. And we encourage everyone here to self-organize your own events and your own things. I just want to highlight a few things that have been coming up in our own calendar and our own GFMD civil society events. The first one is in the end of January and early February, our African civil society and African diaspora networks joined together to organize an African forum in Abuja, Nigeria. And Abuja became known as the Abuja Forum. And we've called our process, this sort of kicked off our civil society process. And now we refer to our process as the road from Abuja to Geneva. And I'll mention in a quick second why it's Geneva and not Paris, as some of you might be expecting. That also followed with other civil society events at the regional level and a number of series of different things. On the GFMD side, we've already had one thematic workshop on labor and migration, as well as labor and climate change and migration. We have a prep meeting that Helena was just referring to, and we'll discuss that from the thematic leads in coming up soon. And what's coming up? Next month, there will be a cultural event at a museum. So the discussion around narratives and culture will be front and center. And this will be followed by a workshop on environmental displacement, so really around climate change. So those two themes will be focused on in these two upcoming workshops. And we will share, and we have shared an open call for civil society to participate in these workshops online, and we will share that after this as well for anybody who needs that registration information. And then we will have more events coming up as we organize towards this. But the very last thing that we just want to mention is that the summit for the GFMD, ultimately all of this builds up towards the summit in the GFMD. The summit in the GFMD will actually take place not in Paris, as it was originally planned. And you can see we haven't even updated it. It was originally planned for around February of next year, but it's now changed to January, and it will take place in Geneva. And the reason for this is because our French chairs have told us that next year, of course, there's going to be a Summer Olympics in Paris, and all the large venues have been booked up. So unfortunately, there's no space to hold such a big event, such as the GFMD summit. Instead, it has been moved to Geneva, a very international city, where also very many of the governments have easy access because they all have permanent missions and embassies there. So that's where it will take place. And we will have, on January the 22nd, we will have a civil society preparatory day that will lead us into the rest of the week of the GFMD. And we'll share more details about that later on. So we'll turn it back to Helena, and we'll turn it back to our thematic leads to discuss the themes as we go through them. Thanks, Helena.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much. If you have any questions about what Colin said, please start putting them on the chat, write them down so that at the end of this first round, we can start to answer any of those questions. But as Colin mentioned, we have 6 groups, and part of the idea that we have for today was trying to change a little bit the order to give also a chance to listen to some voices first. And so it only makes sense that, of course, we begin our discussion with probably a topic that is very close and important to all of us, which is labor migration, a topic that I think we all understand and work closely with. And so we have the 2 persons that are going to be speaking to us about the discussion on labor migration, and they are Irem Arf from the International Trade Union Conference and Don Tolentino from Building and Woodworkers International. So Irem and Don, please come and join us and tell us about the discussion and your views in terms of which topics, what perspectives, what questions should be discussed during the Global Forum on Migration and Development.
Thank you, Helena. Colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. As introduced, I'm with Irem from the ITC. We'll try our best to, in this conversation, to come up with some inputs that we can bring forth to the pen holder, because it's the International Labour Organization, the ILO, who was tasked upon to prepare and collect and then make the final, I hope, of the background paper that will be used in the thematic sessions. Ours is round table 4, labor and migration. If you note, the draft 0 has 4 main outlines: the introduction, which dealt with, of course, the background of COVID, how migrant workers have been considered as essential workers, their contribution despite the many challenges at the same times of the working conditions, the wage step issues, and so on. And it also deals with the development since 2001. Of course, the period that we are moving out of the pandemic, and war that also somehow put us a little step backward, and of course the shortage of workers, because the business economies are recovering. And then, of course, the first ever International Migrants Migration Forum in 2022 in New York. And it dealt also with the emerging issues. Climate change, we will not have to deal with that because there's another separate roundtable with exclamation point, as explained by Celine. And then rapid technological changes that can influence the fair and effective labor governance. And of course, if there's a skill shortage, there is a recognition that skills will have to be one of the priority, and recognition of these skills in one country to the other. And at the end, it has several proposed recommendations, among others, the promotion of the ILO Conventions 181 on fair recruitment, strengthening of the rights-based decent work focus mechanisms for the entire cycle of migration, even to the reintegration of migrants as a result of crisis as experienced in the COVID pandemic. Good practices that can be shared, that has a right-based approach to pathway for labor migration. And of course, again, on skills, recognition of skills and upskilling, and promotion of positive narrative around migration, and promotion, lastly, as they say, of research on triple win outcomes of migration. One of the key example that we are actually very proud is not BWI, but it's the PSI, the Public Services International Experience of migrant nurses, migrant workers in Germany. In the consultation that we managed to present on behalf of the trade union and the CSO online, we have, of course, started articulating that it must be based on rights-based framing. You heard this from us, that migrant workers have the right to self-organization for collective bargaining purposes, regardless of their migration status. It has something to do with the firewalls and so on. And our interest on social protection, that is also portable as much as the systems will warrant it. In the exchange of this conversation, many have, of course, articulated a similar concern, but I've noted in particular interest of a concern on circular migration. This is a serious concern for us. But what is interesting in the conversation, a colleague mentioned that it has to be also governed or subjected into rights-based framework, this circular migration. And we know that we have just a few days remaining to present our input collectively and be considered. And there are guide questions that was raised in the paper that has been circulated by OMU. For example, how do we frame it, aside from what we have already discussed in the other online discussion in the action committee, that it should be rights-based. Number two, what are the issues that we believe should be omitted or improved further in the zero draft, and what should be highlighted instead. And of course, if we can provide good practices and from our own learning experiences in terms of lessons learned, articles that can be referred to in your website or documents or reports. That's what we can do for now, and then we are willing to listen to you on your contributions. This is being recorded. I will take some notes, but I will ask the Secretariat to provide us the audio record later on. Please bear with me. I'm doing multiple tasks. I'm looking after my grandson, so you can hear from the background. But Ireland might have something to add on before we take your perspective. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you, Dong. I think you covered the whole the background paper and this previous discussions we have had with the civil society organizations very, very clearly. Maybe just to highlight, I think overall with the background paper, my take from what is written is there's quite a lot of focus on regular pathways, but with more focusing on the skills needs of the destination countries, and that can become a concern in the sense that the regular pathways should mainly, as a starting point, focus on the needs of the migrants themselves, and consider their rights and access to decent work opportunities. But I believe, if I heard correctly, you did already list the questions that we wanted to ask the colleagues here to hear their feedback. And as you said, we'll be keeping notes and drafting an input to the background paper based on the comments we hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please start to think about whether you have any comments, any suggestions as they are asking in terms of labor migration, so that can be brought to the forefront of the discussion. And I would also note that Dong is putting some questions in the chat. I don't know, Iram, if you want to read them out loud to make sure that everyone is aware of those questions.
Sure, but I'm not sure if everyone here has the zero draft or has looked at it yet, although Dong already provided an outline of it. But yeah, our questions were around whether there are any concerns over the framing of certain issues within the draft. If there are issues that you think that are missing, that are not covered, and we think should be highlighted, such as social protection and portability of social protection, for example. And if there are issues that we think that are receiving prominence within the zero draft, but we think they shouldn't be highlighted and not take a prominent place in the draft, in the discussions at the GFMD. And lastly, I mean, I think if there are good examples in terms of labor migration that be it around pathways, be it around integration into the labor market of migrants once they're in a host country. If there are good or concerning examples that you would like to share, we'd also be very happy to take note of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's also a comment on the chat that I would like to highlight, because I think it's a good way to look at this discussion, and it's a comment from William Goyce. William, I don't know whether you're in a space where you can take the floor right now.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Hannah. Just to say, the question I'm putting for us to look at is the PMC, that this process of ours is largely a way of giving information out there and mobilizing for some kind of reflection of what the ground is in international and regional spaces or multilateral spaces on migration discourse. So it would be important for us in this process not to get caught up in a mainstream way of acting, which is very compromised in so many ways. The GFMD, and particularly under the French, is a very constrained space at the moment. And so through the PMC, is there any alternatives that we can think of or in ways that we leverage on this global discussion? I think that's going to be important kind of thing. We have 50 people in the room here, and we have much more who follow the recordings. So I think it's time that as a ground up approach, rather than this kind of Geneva approach that we all subscribe to. They determine the themes and we respond to it. What is a grounds up approach? What is a national significance approach that leverages on an international approach? I think it's time to put things from that perspective. but others might have something more to say on that as well. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you, William. And as we are tackling subjects, the next one that I would like to take advantage of the fact that you're here is one that you were speaking with Mamadou Goita. So I would like to ask both of you to share a little bit of your vision on this. I don't think that William Gois needs any introduction, but William Gois comes from Migrant Forum Asia, and Mamadou Goita comes from the Institute for Research and Promotion of Alternatives in Development, IRPAD. So why don't we start with William, and then we can give the floor to Mamadou. And Mamadou, if you want to complement with anything about the Abuja process, that would be wonderful. And then we will follow with Patty, so she can also follow with the Abuja meeting. Go ahead, William, the floor is yours. Sorry, William, you're muted.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, just to say that I will speak on Roundtable 6, which is largely about looking at this kind of engagement of, and largely this Roundtable 6 came about because of the mayoral mechanism, trying to develop, make it a more significant space within the GFMD. And like Colin has said, over the last few years, the mayoral mechanism has kind of gained significance in different spaces, and there is a question of how they can play a bigger role within the GFMD processes and global processes on migration, largely because the claim of the mayoral spaces or the mayoral mechanism or local government mechanism is that they are actually the first responders. Now, while that might be true to some extent, again, I think we need to be a little more critical about it, largely because, at least from our perspective here in Asia, the Middle Eastern region, there is no concept of the mayoral mechanism kind of thing. I'm not sure how widespread this is in other parts of the world as well, kind of thing. It is definitely something that is very prominent in the Western Hemisphere, but not so much in the Eastern kind of hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere. Local government does not play an independent role from national government. In fact, subscribes to everything that the national government plays, and is not necessarily a frontline defender. And that's why, from our perspective, it's not local government that's really a frontline defender kind of thing. It's largely civil society that plays that kind of role. And so for us, again, in a process like this, I think, and I raised this up as well in another call, focusing on this kind of different levels of engagement, is that we should not forget that in most parts of the world, the frontline defenders are civil society. Whether it is the migrant communities themselves that respond, or whether it is civil society organizations in the form of NGOs, or whether it is social movements in terms of how they look at how they respond to situations of calamities or crisis, or even for social concern. So I think that is so important, and this is not being seen in that Roundtable 6. Roundtable 6 is largely about mayoral mechanisms, and somewhere none of these kind of roundtables bring out that clear focus of the role that civil society plays. The GFMD seems to have forgotten that role kind of thing that civil society plays as front line responders. It could have been in Roundtable 6, but there's a sharp absence of it in the paper, largely because the pen holders, of course, or largely the construct of that paper is around the mayoral mechanisms or local government. If we are going to put forward a civil society perspective as frontline responders to issues of migrant workers, then I think that this Roundtable 6 would have to carry some of that thinking in that. But that is all for now.
Thank you, William. And Mamadou, can you follow William, please, on this discussion on multi-level governance?
Hello.
Yes, hello, Mamadou.
Hello.
Welcome. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear the rest. There was a cut. No, I think that William has summarized. No, the challenge of his working group is about just opening these thematic issues on the essential multi-stakeholder participation in the processes, because it's really focusing on the government and the government themselves, the states and the local authorities. Now, those are synthesized here in the mayoral mechanism. But CS was being really absent in this dynamic. And then how are we going to work on some of the challenges that are related around the three key questions that are asked here that need to be open, not only at the geographic level, but also at the thematic on the thematic issues, because all these other issues that are related, if you look at the system that is in place, actually looking at the UN organizational model, but also the way that discussions are made at the country level, but also regional level, is very problematic if you don't just open this, what we call in French, décloisonner this thematic area, and then open it to CSO dynamic and how this diversity of perspectives on different issues can be really feeding this. So our challenge here as CSO's group mechanism is to just first put that we open. Last time for the meeting, we just alert them saying that we are more likely talking about government instead of talking about governance, because how the synergy between different stakeholders can be the key challenge, on the migration debate in the future. But how we can create also what GFMD has been doing since the very beginning, trying to have more space and more contribution from CSO that have been very instrumental in having this wide debate inside this dynamic like GFMD. So we should continue just to feed this baseline paper on the line of opening it to more CSO's perspective and more multi-stakeholders dynamics, just to make this multi-level governance more relevant for the next GFMD process debate, and also to allow this issue of data that is really completely controlled to some extent by very few actors in the process should also be open. So the issue of capacity, the issue of decision-making processes, upstream what is going on actually need to be highlighted in this. So there are three main issues that have been mentioned in the baseline document around the guiding questions. I think they need to be open to what extent CSOs can be at the front line of the discussions, of the interactions between different stakeholders. If you look at even between the government and the local government that are mentioned in this, mainly from the beginning to the end, you will see that the CSOs has to play a big role instead of capacitizing them, not only, but also creating an open view of a right-based approach in what has been done so far in the migration processes, be it at the country of departure, but also the country of the host countries, and using all the regional perspective that we have also mentioning, that also William mentioned at the very beginning of what has been said. So I will just say that these three issues about the member states and the regional government applying the whole governance is really very limitative of what we're talking about. And if you look at also the financing system that exists so far, you cannot just we can talk about mobilization of resources to allow these players to play their role, but how CSO's group, and also why not also the engaged civil private sector can be more vivid in the process that we are talking about, and the design and implementation of all the perspective of monitoring and evaluation of the dynamic of the different international instruments. Also, I think that they need also to be open at the same way to CSO that are more lively to make the policies and the practices more relevant for the migration dynamic that exists so far. So I will just stop here, that we need really to work hard on this thematic group to make it more relevant for our perspectives too.
Thank you, Mamadou. It is definitely challenging, and it is, I think, very useful to us all to listen to these different questions around our own understanding of multi-level governance and where are the opportunities, the needs, and the voids for civil society to start working on it, both in the context of the GFMD, of course, but there may be other forums, other spaces, even locally, where there may be an opportunity for that. Mamadou, you did not talk about the Abuja process. I don't know whether you would like to mention anything or you would like to leave that for Patty to share anything else.
Yeah, Patty will share it. So this is a very relevant thing because we have been addressing these issues too in our Abuja process, just to prepare the African voice on as a process also, not GFMD as an event, but as a process that would not only build the African voice on these issues, and mainly on the governance level, but also other issues like diaspora and labor and climate, but to help also to frame collectively. We can add to the voice from the East, but also from the other regions, so that we can be more stronger in the process of this GFMD. That is very relevant, critical for the future of migration debate in the world. So we have been doing this process as building this African voice, but also open to all the other regions that we invited also in Abuja, and we are continuing to deepen the key issues that are really relevant, and inviting also some other stakeholders to join us in the dynamic, so that we can just build a stronger voice for the continent, but also with other continent, just to make it happen at the heart of this process. So Paddy will talk about a different aspect of it. It's a process, it's a content, but also it's a kind of methodology that we want to draw on the governance of migration for the future in this dynamic of GFMD.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. And with that, allow me to invite Patty Siyanga Knudsen, Vice President of GRFDT, a migration and governance expert, to the table. Patty was in the discussion on public narratives on migration and culture. This is, of course, an overarching topic that involves us all, but I think that in order to make the full connection with the Abuja process, it's a great time to give the floor to Patty. Welcome, Patty. Thank you for joining us today.
Helena, thank you very much. And I think this is a very timely opportunity under the PMC series for us to zoom into the GFMD discussion, and really hoping that we can get a lot of traction to the various issues that are being discussed today, and particularly on the narratives. I think what was very important, maybe first of all, to kick off, we are not the only thematic experts on this. We've got the NGO Committee on Migration. That is also a thematic expert, and this particular roundtable looks at improving the perception of migration in public opinion through narratives, culture, emotion, and rational discourse. So as with the others, there has been a call to different members of the roundtables that have been requested to contribute in response to the outputs from this roundtable. Very specific, two particular outputs that will form the basis, or rather that the roundtable is looking forward to have as a background paper and also an outlook paper. So the co-chairs are Philippines and the Philippines and Canada, and the pen holder in this particular case is ICMPD. And very important, I think, also to note that we had quite a very interesting discussion. I think that the co-chairs themselves were really looking forward to engage much more lightly, much more informally. I think as has not been the case, particularly maybe for other groups. So we could feel that there was a bit of trying to set everybody at ease as we walked into this particular session. But what was really important, I think, in terms of the background paper and the global migration narratives outlook, as they're being called, these two papers, one was more that it was going to be more of a reflective paper, one that would be used within the group, and then the other that will obviously become the public document that will go out. So the co-chairs, as I have mentioned, really would like to, the idea was for them to use the roundtable to ask us a number of questions, those of us who were on the roundtable. So you had member states, you had other organizations as well who were present, in terms of what do we really think about what kind of work that needs to go into putting together these two, the background paper and the Global Migration Narratives Report. We were presented with an outline of what the and some sketchy ideas of what the global migration narratives outlook would look like. And I think quite immediately we could see that there were some issues which we managed to raise from the thematic expert point of view in terms of representation. We echoed these in the room itself, and we've continued to do that also in other spaces where we're able to find and engage with the co-chairs in terms of the fact that the regions have been selected, or at least there's some preliminary ideas, and they were also kind of, in a way, we felt that Africa in particular was also quite left out, and then the emphasis on Asia was very much on the Southeast Asia, and we wanted to understand a bit to the background to where we were, where was this framing come from? And I think that's the kind of engagement that is important, that comes also from civil society, as we will go and make the different reactions in the opportunities that were provided for, such as the survey now. I think that one of the most important things for this global migration narratives outlook, I mean, in one way, we are all calling these three thematic areas as sort of cross-cutting issues, right? So we're looking at narratives, we're looking at rights, and we're also looking at multi-level governance as cross-cutting issues. And I just think that, for instance, particularly for the narrative, is essentially important because narratives begin to form policy. They form opinions, and these opinions are carried by individuals who are policymakers. And so just using that very basic frame in terms of looking at it, it's really important that the outputs of this particular roundtable can really feed off, for instance, from the diaspora perspective, from the labor migration perspective, but also from the climate change perspective. And when we sat with the civil society group, it was very clear that you had very interesting and dynamic perspectives that need to come from these very hardcore thematic areas, if you like, on labor migration, on climate change migration, and on diaspora, and how those really feed into this particular one. So while it's seen as cross-cutting and you can almost say you would leave it on the side, I think it's important that feedback would come, particularly when we're talking about the civil society that's gathered here today in terms of feeding into this. So what is the feeding? I think the feeding that the roundtable is really looking for is what are those relevant case studies that are out there. So the questions that were being asked in the particular roundtable, but also that are being asked even moving forward now through the different organizations who should provide, is to try and define for ourselves what is public narratives on migration. We obviously within definition, but that's really restricted to the work. And that diversity is very important in terms of setting the scene. But I think it's also particularly very important because the working group, or rather the roundtable, would like to establish some kind of a common understanding. Now, it may not be a uniform understanding, and that's why that diversity of views on what public narratives on migrants and refugees looks like is very critical, and particularly coming out of civil society as an important part of the actors that will contribute to this exercise. At the same time, they want to get a sense of what is really happening in terms of who are the people that are around that are shaping these narratives, who are shaping the narratives on migrants and refugees. What do we really see in terms of, public attitude and the perception towards migrants and refugees? Can are we aware of the kind of differences that we see in attitudes when you look at a city perspective, when you're looking at the peri-urban perspective, from an organization perspective, from whichever perspective, and in what ways can we see these kind of differences? And all this is, I think, is very important, particularly in looking at having a diversity of data that you will have available to understand the background and the setting. But then at the same time, what can we bring forward as those case studies and initiatives? What is really specific that has already been done, that plans that, ideas that are still, are being conceptualized or are close to being implemented? What are those that promote that balanced migration narrative, right? And what are those that really also counter misinformation when we look at migrants and refugees? So these kind of issues are very important in bringing out, not because we just want to lay a basis or a whole blanket of best practice, but really in talking also about what are those key challenges, what does it take to get there? And very, two very other important issues, of course, innovative approaches is a very big part of it, as is other sections that we have seen as well, where they're trying to look at innovative approaches, but at the same time also trying to understand the spheres of influence, understanding how do you engage with vulnerable populations, for instance, how do you rope in these success stories? But also very important is this whole of society approach in the targets that are being for the initiatives that are out there on narratives, and also the messaging. Now, I think one would say there's enough out there, right? One would think, I think if we were to put this, as I was thinking about it the other day, as I was, trying to fill out the form for JRFDT, and thinking that if you provided this to a secondary school student and said, this is your assignment, they just needed to sit on the internet and really look and dive into the range of examples that we have. So what are we really asking civil society, I think, to do? And this is, I think, what we need to ask ourselves as the question: where do we really see the key turning point in some of these issues? And how do we bring out the very specific issues? Because with narratives, it has to really be specific initiatives. There will never be a blanket that's comfortable to cover everyone across the board. But of course, there will be some places where we can all get, the same amount, a basic level of heat. But what is really essential to move on this particular subject? And I think an ambition, thematic, as a thematic expert on this lead, as an ambition is really to move from where we just have narratives, but to have narratives that will really influence a public policy. Will we ever see that before? I mean, we have a short time before the summit obviously is coming through, and the background paper will be produced that feeds into other processes. But can we see this having a real life under the GFMD? That is the question. Or does it become a priority for one group, left into, sitting into a working group, or split into different spaces because we don't want the kind of attention, or we are not willing to have champion initiatives by countries, by groups that need to move this particular one forward? So this, I think, as from a thematic expert point of view, I would say this is the challenge that we have, is really to present and be bold enough to present what we think is essential to really make an impact on this so-called movable middle, as it is described. Very briefly, and I will stop with the Abuja Forum, and linked to also all the other work that's happening around the thematic expert. The real idea is really, how do we also allow self-mobilization to happen alongside? Under the PMC, we have a lot of great examples. We've seen what we were able to do under the IMRF with no resources, limited resources, late notifications to meetings, closed doors where we had to squeeze ourselves through windows, and even in UN meetings where we could not even be able to interact with member states. And yet we've got some results of how we were able to engage and interact. Maybe we don't see them every day in our everyday work, but there are some strides. So how do we use energy from all the different spaces like this? And that's what we're trying to gather also in the Africa group. How do we use the space that is there with this depth of knowledge, with this depth of information, to move different messages that come through? How do we engage with roundtable, how do we engage with member states to be more proactive on roundtables as well? How do we engage ourselves? How do we mobilize ourselves and bring those messages across so that these background papers and everything that is an output is reflective of the African story as far as the Abuja Forum is concerned? So I think we have also just set out a notification today for the Africa Forum, calling upon African civil society organizations, diaspora, trade unions to join us for the virtual forum that we're holding next week, where we take a deep dive into some of these issues that we'll be talking about today. So today is also a very good day for us to get a bit deeper into the various points. Thanks a lot, Helen.
Mari, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very thoughtful and reflective presentation that is inviting also us to think about what our contribution should be, and also the importance of narratives and how we all need to start working on narratives. And as you are really brilliantly pointing out, different experiences, different voices from what we are confronting in our specific regions. I would now like to move to the topic of diasporas, which I think is also a topic which is close to many of us, which we understand its importance. And we have Bryce Monu from Forum, who can join us and tell us about that discussion connected to diaspora. Welcome. Bonjour. Do you want to speak in French or in English?
Merci beaucoup, Elena. Je me permets de dire que je vais parler aussi au nom de Stella de la Forte, qui n'est pas là, qui a eu des obligations, qui n'a pas pu venir. Et donc, moi, je me présente d'abord, je suis Binori Brice-Mono, vice-présidente du Forum, qui est une plateforme des diasporas en France. Alors, je ne reviendrai surtout pas sur ce que les autres ont dit, mais simplement, j'aimerais dire quelque chose d'important. C'est que
I would like to say something important. After Abuja and at that time where we were, at the level of diaspora, we have reached on some of supporting assistance. First, improve the relationship between diaspora and countries of origin and countries of residence in order to improve the status of the productive methods. Second, improving methods of transferring remittances. This does not at the financial level. We are all aware of obligations of diaspora that affect development. To create a favorable environment,
diaspora, etc. Veiller à ce que la diaspora puisse conserver ses droits civils.
We have to make sure that the diaspora is capable of preserving its political forces as well as its capabilities, such as, for example, the right to vote abroad, in addition to the representation of the government. And on this, of course, it's very important to add that in the country of residence, we are fighting today, and I can give you the example of France. And of course, this is the possibility for the foreigners to, for example, vote and to take part in the communal elections or the mayoral elections. And this is, of course, a part of the diaspora networks in order to be capable of ensuring the transfer of competencies, the improvement of qualifications, as well as the creation of job opportunities by involving diaspora as partners. We say as partners because until now, we had the impression that diaspora or that the migrants are subject to study, are hamsters. However, they are not organized. Migrants they need to organize themselves in the same platform, but even when they organize, they never partner, though we are the same components.
partners
of the same
being
mechanisms and strategies, even in
main
the
components
countries of development. So this is
development.
why we are here
insist
talking about the
on the
partner
word
aspect, because it
partners
changes
because it
the
changes
situation. During the past
the equation.
meeting with the governments, we discussed the
We
issues
have
that were
also
related to
talked about
the vocables or the terms
terminology.
that need to be
We
used,
have
which means that
asked
we were raising
ourselves,
questions.
what does diaspora mean? Which definition should we adopt?
As long
IOM,
as
African Union, and
we still have
as
not
long as
discussed
the
this
civil
issue,
society has not adopted a unified definition, this
and
means
this is of
that
course
we don't
available
know
when
what
it
we're
comes
going
to
to use as
political
our
values. So this is
speak as
something that is very
in our
important. The
policy.
diaspora that has been discussed, and this is, of course, related to the diaspora as being the vector of development. The word vector is very important for us. And this was very important. And this is, of course, very important, especially that we are discussing how important it is when it comes to the discussions have chosen to actually pull over the good practices. And we are talking about the cases of some of the missions that were entrusted with financing the projects of development. You had given me the names of projects, and at the same time, the diaspora is as well co-funding up to 10% those projects. And these strategies and these partnerships that are very strong when it comes to these components are very important. And we are working at the same time with other NGOs, whether we're talking about the diaspora or anyone else. And this is, of course, with the private sector. And at the same time, we are, of course, related to working with women in villages. This means that we are talking about the projects of development and to see the extent to which those projects are respecting the realities on the ground, while of course making sure that we are maintaining the sustainable aspect. Another element that we must not forget, which is related to the transfer of competencies. When the project is related to one sectoral aspect, we have the diaspora that is expert in this field and that is now mobilizing in order to implement those projects in these entities. And the specificities are that not only do we have projects and 17 calls for projects and 17,000 calls for proposals, and we have, of course, we have actually the OECD countries where we have a total of 41 countries that are involved in our projects. So we have 6 in Africa, 7 in Asia, 6 in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 2 in the Near East. So this means that the diaspora, wherever they may be found, are capable of working everywhere in the world, wherever they may be. We are in France, but nevertheless, we are working on a project on the Near East, and we are working as well on projects everywhere in the world. And what is very important for this is that we need a partnership, we need actors, and we need as well a very strong support for technical and financial partners. And here, we need as well to be well structured. Then allow me to give you the example of a fund that is now working when it comes to the investments of diaspora that are related to climate change. And before actually engaging in research when it comes to this specific domain and investments in green enterprises and the green economy being considered as an adaptation as well as a response to climate change in Ghana, which has enabled us not only to identify the willingness of this diaspora, but as well when it comes to following up on the implementation of the pilot programs of the for the diaspora. This said that there are several challenges that we're encountering, and now we can come up with the best practices, with the recommendations. The first one is related to saying that once the civil society has enumerated, and whether we're talking about the good practices and the good stories, what can we do with this? Are we only using them for the GFMD, or shall we only continue using them or continue implementing them by selecting or by choosing one thematic, one very strong thematic that could be engaging everyone? And while we wait for the GFMD, we will be capable of working on the implementation of something that is concrete, something that will enable us to be together and to be capable of sharing a very important message that is global around a topic that is a very crucial topic that contains several narratives and examples to say that we don't need that the diaspora or the migrants actually approve. Of course, we are talking about all these aspects. If we have concrete examples, and if we come and share and tell them this is how we have been working with the X government or with Y partner, then maybe only then they will be capable of moving forward. What about the challenges? The challenges today are very important. It's about how to better work with the government, and we believe that it's paramount to improve our competencies and our skills, because working with the governments is not something that is very simple. It's not like working with any of the civil society components. We need, when working with the government, we need to have key people who have the skills, the capabilities, as well as the profile. And when it comes to the civil society, we need to have a pool of competencies among the diaspora in each and every country when it comes to some practices, so that at every situation we are capable of saying that in that country we can have a person that is capable of following up on the practical examples. I shall end with this. We will have several examples. We've had several examples of good practices, but to go even further, let's highlight some of the issues that are related to the valuing of competencies. You can imagine actually how we can acknowledge competencies and diplomas. Allow me to give you an example. Any person that is migrating on a regular basis and that is regularly residing has actually accepted work as a nurse, whereas he is a doctor. So here, of course, there is a Lisbon actually a convention that needs to be implemented in Europe. I believe that these are practical examples that we needed to look into closely for things that to move around. We've had the same case in the UK and everywhere else. And migrants, especially the diaspora, is actually going through all this. And when it comes to the SDGs, this is one of the very important issues that are related to the diaspora. I'm talking about SDG number 17 on partnership to develop a multi-stakeholders partnership and to look into to ensure the political governance. We do not want any government to actually fall behind the implementation of the directives as well as the laws, and this could have some very burdening consequences on the communal level. SDG number 5. Here, of course, we can say that we as civil society organizations, we are requiring that the women's problematic is actually assigned somewhere else, whereas development, as already mentioned, is conducted by women equally as well. When we talk about the diaspora, when we talk about women who have proven during COVID to be capable of stabilizing economies in continents and who are considered to be invisible, we were not capable of improving a bit their situation. Now, as you can see, there is, of course, a partnership for action, which is very important for us. And this is everything I have to say. If you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Breeze, for bringing this perspective on diasporas. I think that there is one line that you mentioned that really it was left with me, which was this idea of a vector of development. I think that this is a crucial element of how we understand diasporas. And I think that you also included a long list of arguments. And I wonder, how long do we need to continue insisting and having that same agenda? Year after year, over and over again, we continue to discuss and pledge for elements such as recognition of professional titles, acknowledgement of them, and allowing people to continue exerting their professions if they had the opportunity to have a university education, that their trade, that their experience is valuable in other places. So now let's try to move on. We have two pending topics. One of them is rights and migration. Unfortunately, we do not have any representatives who participated in that round, who were able to speak, who can join us today. And so we have the last topic, which is climate change and migration. And I have the very weird opportunity of having to present on a topic that I was working with Marie Lovejoy from Secours Catholique, Caritas France. So I would like to share with you briefly some of the points that we brought to that table. The first one is to acknowledge and to express our appreciation for the fact, as Colin just said at the beginning of the discussion today, that climate change is included. William was at the right session. Okay, William, then I will ask you to speak about that one as I allow me to finish this short presentation on climate, and then you can follow with that. So, acknowledging that climate change is an existential threat and that we need to treat this topic accordingly, I think is an important element forward. And it's also an invitation to us all to think how we include elements of climate change in our understanding and advocacy on all of the issues that we have discussed today. There were a few mentions of climate change, and I think it's a good point of departure. The second point that I think it's also crucial that we tried to make today is an invitation for us all to reflect on how we understand development, because no actual development is possible without a climate lens. And I think that that's also a cross-cutting issue that we want to bring into the table, which we think it's important. We would like to underscore that there was a discussion about the need to create and strengthen regular and permanent, and we added and underscored permanent migration pathways, because that is something that we really wanted to insist as being a crucial element and a crucial demand on our part. We also underscored that migration cannot be a last-minute strategy to respond to climate change, and that there is also the need, of course, to focus on the children and the youth, and as well as those groups that are particularly impacted, considering their conditions of vulnerability. We insisted on the need to consider indigenous communities and their ancestral relation to the territory when we're talking about climate change and migration. We also added that the nexus between conflict, human insecurity, and climate change as a driver of migration needs to be brought to this conversation, and it's a key element. Bearing these elements in mind, I think that the conversations that we hold with governments in the context of the GFMD at the local level and in other fora should start by asking about their own policy plans that include climate change, environmental degradation, and human mobility. How are those plans being put in place? What considerations are there? What resources do they need? What resources do they have? How are they including the impacted communities? Those are the key issues that we think should be brought to this discussion. We also think that it's necessary to expand our understanding of climate change and human mobility, not only to international migration, but also to include internal displacement. That it's necessary that we continue also reviewing our own understanding of what we consider to be forced versus what we consider to be voluntary. And this is fundamental for purposes of international protection. A last very important that we tried to raise in this issue was the need to consider when we discuss loss and damage funds, how they are actually going to reach the directly impacted communities. And it's underscoring that these funds should be used to create resilience. Nothing is going to change on the ground if we allow those resources to simply be passed on to the government, but we do not make sure that they reach the impacted individuals. Based on this, we insist that there is the policy coherence on climate change and human mobility is essential, and that there are opportunities for co-construction on cohesion with civil society. We need a seat at the table. We have proposals. We are directly working with the communities, and that's why we need to be allowed into the space with our multiple and plural voices. We also underscore that there are bilateral, binational, and multilateral initiatives that need to be considered and showcased as part of this process. In terms of other elements that we brought to the table that I think are worth mentioning is when I mentioned long-term solutions, permanent solutions. And so we also express our concern, for instance, for the use of temporary work visas. And this is where we make a link to discussions in other groups, which are not protecting workers' rights. So we said that we need to, beyond the right to work, ensuring rights at work is essential, and that these elements should be considered when we are discussing climate change and migration. A temporary solution is not a good enough solution. We also insisted, something that was brought from our own discussions with civil society groups, was the importance of promoting climate literacy, ensuring that communities directly impacted are receiving the education to understand the impacts and the prospects in these initiatives, including relocation plans that must be discussed, consulted with the populations concerned, and not constrained by external actors is something that we also brought to the table. Finally, the discussion ended proposing a list of questions. In our view, the discussion moving forward should move in 3 directions, and these are the 3 questions with which I would like to finish. First, how to better integrate climate experts and impacted communities into our understanding, policy making, and action around migration and development. And how can this inclusion ensure the participation of different actors from impacted communities, including indigenous persons, the youth, women, climate experts, political leaders, and civil societies? Second, what are some of the main actions needed to accelerate climate resilient development for mobile and immobile communities? And third, what mechanisms need to be implemented to flexibly support vulnerable communities' needs and ensure protection throughout the mobility process in the context of climate change and environmental degradation? We want to insist that this is not only a discussion of when people move, but also what are we doing to prevent people from being forced to move. And we need to widen that lens and the discussion on this topic. And I will now pass on the floor to William, who participated on the discussion on rights and migration. Go ahead, William.
Thanks, Elena. Just to say, the discussion on migration, on rights, was at the same time as the session on climate change. So those were the 2 parallel kind of thematic discussions happening. It was very interesting that where the climate change session was full, there was no seating space. Every person in government, UN agency was present in that room on climate change. There was a lot of free space in the rights room where rights was going to be discussed. And Again, Michelle Levoy opened the discussion. She gave a very good presentation. She touched all the issues that are of pertinent to civil society. She raised the issue of undocumented migrants. She raised the issue of regular pathways, of the issue of the detention, and she tried to explain how there have been practices developed over time of collaboration between civil society, UN mechanisms, and government. And the example she cited was on the no detention of children. So in many senses, while there was a rights presentation from a civil society perspective there, what was critical was that there were very few governments in the room. Not only were there very few governments in the room, there was no question of call for ratification of any conventions by any of the governments that were in the room. They did question what was interesting was that the governments that did take the floor by way of interventions were largely what would be considered countries of origin. So Philippines, for one, took the floor. Thailand took the floor, and Zimbabwe took the floor. As far as I recall, these were the kind of countries that took the floor to raise kind of issues with regard to rights. Thailand, surprisingly, even asked, maybe we should look into why countries are not ratifying the conventions instead of asking only to ratify. What are the hindrances that prevent countries from ratifying the conventions? This was very interesting as a position coming from the Thai government. Another government that took the floor was Bangladesh as well, and did speak a lot about the issues of workers, migrant workers kind of thing, and the need for there to be greater scrutiny into the protection of rights of migrant workers. Philippines, of course, talked about as well the need for protection, did speak of the convention and what's in the convention. And the only country of destination that took the floor was Spain. And Spain was in the room, and Spain shared some of its own examples of how it is trying to look at its migration policy and the challenges therein that Spain is facing, more in terms of lack of support from the European Union kind of thing. I think it was within that kind of a construct that Spain's intervention was, but saying it was looking at its migration, how to protect the rights of migrant workers and its own migration governance policies. Having said that, then, I think what Colin started by saying was that civil society pushed for in 2008 for the Global Forum on Migration, Global Forum on Migration and Development, to have a discussion on rights when the Philippines chaired the GFMD, which was 2008. From that time when rights was put on the table to now, this year, 2023, there is little appetite for the notion of rights. And there is a lot of appetite now for the discussion on climate. Whether it will become a rights discourse is something to be looked into. The other issue is also, for the first time, probably we have more space for rights discourse within the GFMD. If you problematize the climate discourse and the presentation that Helena just gave, together with the labor discourse and then this rights session, there is, in some ways, in a technical way, even a lot more space to discuss of rights. But the issue is rights is not being discussed, at least not being discussed by the governments in that manner, in the way we would like to see it to be discussed. And that's why, once again, I think it is important, because I don't think the official process and the official kind of paper writing process will be able to capture or will be able to carry through the recommendation on rights kind of thing. I think there will be a lot of cherry picking. Egypt is the chair of the rights session, and they said they are willing to take on ideas from civil society. They are open to that. But at the end of the day, it would be, I guess, the pen holder decides on what goes into it. And that's why I think there is a way of, again, I'm saying, for other processes aside from the official processes, where the PMC and other processes might be there at the regional and national levels, to be able to make a connection between the rights discourse and all of these themes would be critical. As long as, and I think this would be one way of leveraging a ground-up approach, a perspective on the global forum. Otherwise, like Eva Sanders says, it might just be an academic exercise. And like Stefan has also agreed to, that this might just be another multilateral conference in Geneva, which is known for hosting international conferences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am mindful of the time. I know we have only a few minutes, but I want to ask whether there are any questions from the floor.
Elena, Eva Sanders and Vinod Khadaria have their hands up.
Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I just
Yes, Eva, we can hear you. Thank you for joining us.
With my croaky voice, sorry, but I just wanted to say to this very fascinating session, I think that there was an enormous amount of thoughtfulness that went into how these topics can be explored and expanded. The one thing that I think is missing, frankly, is the point that William made at the beginning, but I think it's absolutely essential. And that is that it still remains, at least at the roundtable level, an academic procedure. And it's not working. At least it's certainly not working the way it should, given what we as civil society would like to have in terms of impact. And I was wondering if we could take maybe a part of the next session to actually have some discussion and examples of what it in fact means to transform an academic discussion into one where we as civil society are the frontline responders. I certainly think, for example, that what happened, at the last, steadily coming towards the last GFMD, where actually states were willing and to have sessions together with civil society outside of the UN context, I think makes so much more sense, frankly speaking. And I think it's something we should plan on and push for, rather than just say it's a good idea. It takes some work. So that's my suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you I think that's a very important and useful suggestion. So I can see that there are other hands up. I think the next hand up is Vladimir Pascual, and then I can see Vinod Kadria. Vladimir, adelante. Vladimir is going to be speaking in Spanish, so please make sure to change to...
Thank you, Elena. Will, I want to send great hugs and congratulate everyone for this amazing work that you're doing. It's very interesting to receive the summaries from each of the roundtables, and just want something I would like to add to this discussion in the multi-level relation table. Migrants often find ourselves trapped when the central government has a political tendency and the local government has a different one. So then, for example, the relationship to create policies towards the migrant populations is broken because of the political commitments of both governments, local and national. So there, for example, I don't know, what could we suggest? How could we work at that level when, for example, here in Spain, concretely, when the national government was saying no towards help to migrants, irregular migrants, local governments, some that were from a different political tendency, were saying, yes, we will be providing help. We will be tending to the health of irregular migrants, right? So I think there's a very important topic there to suggest that migration policies should be a state policies, not a party line policy. Something else that I wanted to agree upon also from our French colleague, what we're missing is we're here in Spain, for example, and I would like to have a more direct relationship. You know, today in June 1st, Spain will taking over the chairmanship of the European Council. I think that's a good space from us here in Spain to press the government, the Spanish government, so that the migrant agreement for Europe will come out in very poor conditions based on what is apparently coming, because the extreme right, or just the right in the European Union, is generating this anti-migration policies. So from there, it's important to suggest to keep this unity, and perhaps might be able to come together, and at least those of us who are still in Europe, and also those who are in Latin America, those who are working in the United States, or William from Asia, this unity is very important, I would say. And finally, to say that because we are of Latin origin, Ecuadorian, when Ecuador in 2024, when Ecuador assumes the general Ibero-American form, we want to work on that unity of the migration policies. I think that a suggestion that we always say, repeating to the government, is why from Latin America or Africa or Asia, don't governments come together so that they defend the rights of migrants, those who are outside, but also true, those who are part of our countries. Very often we shout to the outside for our rights in the case of Ecuador, but inside the rights, migrants' rights are violated, those who came to our country. So I think that I wanted to point that out. Thank you, Helena.
Gracias, Vladimir.
Thank you, Vladimir.
Very much, Vladimir. I also want to point out to an intervention on the chat by Mario Alves from Portugal, who is also representing an organization, Poco dos Negros district of the Cabo Verdean Creole migration in Lisbon, because I also think that this is an opportunity to connect among different groups that are working in different countries. As you just pointed out, Vladimir, you know, those who are working in France and those who are working in Portugal. It's like, you know, you can communicate across borders even. It makes it easier for those groups to try to connect. And thank you for those comments in the chat. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Vinod Karia. Professor Karia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helena. Well, I just have a very brief point to mention, but it's very important point. You know, drawing from William's position, Williams pointing out a very important difference between the developed countries' local governments at the mayoral level play a very important role, but that is not so in the developing countries of the global south. I think this is important to take note of in the context that we should perhaps now create this awareness and encourage the countries in the global south to activate that role of the mayoral level, which is missing, rather than saying that this is a difference. This is important because post-COVID-19 or during COVID-19, we saw large-scale migration within countries, internal migration. And that, I think, becomes a great responsibility at the city level, at the municipal level, and we do not have that structure at the moment. I'm talking from the point of view of my own experience of India, which actually had a very, very large-scale internal displacement. I think there is a continuum in terms of this kind of internal migration, displacement, and refugee movements. So I think we should, rather than putting them in different boxes, we should try to find what is it that connects them together and what kind of policy intervention by national governments, local governments, and international organizations are necessary to be pressed for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Binan. I think that this discussion has shown us first the importance of establishing connections between topics. They are not isolated. There is a connection among them. Also, we need to think how we can feed into more than one topic, which is definitely a challenge. But I also want to go back to Eva's proposal, which, as we can see, there is a lot of agreement with it on the chat. This very important question on how we can transform what is becoming an academic discussion into one in which civil society, as being the ones who are at the front line responding, can play a role. And I think that if you have any ideas or suggestions in this aspect, would be wonderful. We definitely can commit to having a next session and trying to identify speakers who can come to share that with us. And I was wondering, Professor Binari, perhaps you have any ideas or suggestions on how to transform an academic discussion into a people's discussion.
Helena, this is a very, very pertinent point. How do we step into the shoes of the, partially, even if it is partially of the policy makers, not policy makers, but the bureaucrats, because policy makers make policies, but they don't go into the practices. What actually is on the ground is what is implemented, and that's where I think the divide lies between policy and practice. So I think it is important to introduce accountability. Accountability is the key word, because that is what is also missing in GCM. It is all lofty ideals, and it stops there. And that's, I think, the situation when we say that it is all academic discussion. The academic discussion does not have that teeth. That teeth has to be brought in. That can happen only through accountability. And this accountability also has to be of a particular kind. I have seen that it becomes nobody's baby when the accountability is general of the entire government. Nobody wants to take, bell the cat. So that's where I think it is important that the accountability should be at the individual level. It's going to be hard to press for that, but I think if an effort is made today, maybe in 5 years' time, some progress will be made, because over time we see in the realm of law and action by the judiciary, and I'm observing it right now in the case of India, where we do have a very dynamic Supreme Court Chief Justice who is taking on the government on micro level in terms of practices like the government, when they give responses, they used to give it in sealed covers. And the Supreme Court Chief Justice said, we are going to be fully transparent. We are not going to accept any sealed covers. You know, these are the crux of the nuts and bolts of how to transform academic exercise into implementable, accountable exercises. And this is my off-the-cuff thought.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. Yes, Professor Binod, I think the key two words here are accountability and implementation. And I really like that example that you bring from the Supreme Court, because definitely there are practices that really change how conversations are taking place and who is brought into the table. William, the floor is yours. William Goiz.
Thanks. Thank you, Helena. And now Binod has put us in a fix. Why in a fix? Because neither the GFMD nor the GCM are meant to be accountable processes. The governments made sure of that from the very beginning when setting up these processes. That's why the GCM is only as an afterthought now, thinking of some indicators, minimum indicators kind of thing. It's recognizing that there has to be some kind of accountability, whereas the GFMD has been this process of dialogue and sharing of practices and things like that, but the accountability is not there. And this is where I think the accountability is something that we hold governments to. And I think that is what is going to be important, is how do we develop an accountability process wherein when we go into these spaces or we engage with these spaces, we engage it in a way that holds representation of government in those spaces as being accountable. Now, and I think that accountability starts at the national level. And that's why I think the PMC is in that sense well suited, because of this information sharing space that we have. It's well suited to already look at what is the government representation going to be. Most likely, I think if the GFMD is in Geneva next year, most likely it will be the diplomats in Geneva and maybe some coming in from capital. It all depends, because it's the start of the year. Government budgets are not yet in place and things like that. So they might not travel from capital to Geneva. So you'd have the Geneva kind of diplomatic representation. How do you hold that accountable? How do you hold that accountable to what is on the ground? This is something that we as civil society are well positioned to do. But we don't necessarily do that. And maybe it's time, as we think of the GFMD kind of thing coming up, I think it's really good what Eva says. How do these roundtables spaces become more than an academic exercise? Because there is no history. There is no history in the GFMD of any of these papers materializing into an action plan. And or at least not something that we in civil society are aware of. So contributing to a paper means only becoming part of the library of documents out there kind of thing. But making them in a certain sense accountable processes and holding governments accountable to that is something that we need to give more thought of. And I think this is where the next kind of session will be, where we will try to look at, and maybe by way of preparation, Helena, maybe we could think of some questions to circulate already so that people can come prepared with ideas on how to make the roundtables more transformative in that sense, or more accountable, in the words of Binod. Thank you.
I'll just add a word, William, since you have now put me into that pedestal of being accountable for suggesting this. I think we need not feel diffident by the fact that both the GCM and the GFMD does not have the structure of accountability. Our existing structures, and this is where I say that we need to supplement our call for human rights with the call for fundamental rights. And fundamental rights are guaranteed in the national constitutions of various countries. At least it is very much so important in the case of India. And that's where who implements the constitution? It is the judiciary. And that's why I think we need to mobilize the judiciary. And at least, sometimes you do have one dynamic personality in the judiciary that can, show the light. That's, I think, that's one thing that perhaps we can bring in as a new element. So thanks for allowing this.
Thank you. That is definitely innovative and thought-provoking, that question of who is representing states and who else can we bring into the table. And also how, as civil society, we are asking who is being part of a delegation and how decisions are being made of who becomes part of that state delegation. I think that this is indeed a very, very interesting and thought-provoking element for the discussion. I don't know whether anyone else would like to share any other elements, any other hands. Raj Bardui, the floor is yours.
Yes. Are you getting me? Yes. Thank you,
Richard,
Madam
no,
Elena.
we're going to give the floor to Raj Bardui first, and then it will be you.
Hi, thank you very much, Elena. I'm going to take you back to the theme on narratives, which is 6 or 5 or whatever, I don't know now. In the narratives, I see, often the narratives are focused on what is happening in developed countries, how migrants are portrayed in developed countries, and therefore how the policies in developed countries are guided by those narratives from the public, the media, and so on and so forth. But I think very little attention is paid to the narratives in the South, because the 60% of the migration, or the majority of the migration, is within South, from South to South. It's not South to North always. And we are a little bit quiet on that aspect in terms of organization, in terms of accountability, in terms of agitation, in terms of the rights. So it's like covered. And I think there should be special attention paid too, because that's where migrants go, the majority. They are moving from one country in the South to another country. And there are a lot of violations of human rights, labor rights, and treatment and inclusion and so on of migrants in another society in the South. So I think we should perhaps bring that to the attention of our conversation as well as our organization. Secondly, I think we need to also highlight the role of the media, because narratives, quite a few stakeholders were pointed out, but I didn't see much on the role of the media in framing narratives. And as regards accountability, I think bringing in civil society in developed countries. Okay, so it's not only civil society in developing countries asking for accountability. It's also working together, and I'm sure you are, with civil society in developed countries, who then make their leaders accountable to explaining why there is such violation of human rights or labor rights or lack of integration. So there has to be some kind of how we can work together. Is there, in other words, what I'm saying is that work is not going to be in silos, that civil society in developing countries is doing this and they are quite active, and we probably don't know much about what is happening in developed country societies. Is there anything to bring in the network, whereby civil society in developing countries are doing their own thing and in developed, but eventually there is a kind of a platform where they come together and exchange notes and learn from each other. Thank you.
Raj, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that those are very important points to bring to the discussion. And I would now like to give the floor. Patty, I can see you have your hand up, but I had another hand up from someone who spoke a minute ago, and I'm looking for
Richard.
him.
Richard
Richard.
Obedi.
I think Richard is not connected right now. Richard, are you connected? Yes, I'm seeing you. Please
Yes.
go ahead, Richard.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Madam Elena, for the brilliant moderation. I would like to pick it up from the point that you made, I think, in the summary, the bilateral and multilateral initiatives. And I would also tie that with the accountability that Binod and William they've actually ably deliberated on. For me, I would suggest to the all organizers, the GFMD, and then all the other relevant stakeholders, for us to actually capitalize and leverage on these bilateral and multilateral initiatives. Let's pick the case of Uganda and South Sudan. Those are very interesting countries when you look at the EAC, the East African Community, and the International Conference on the Great Lakes. Because in terms of the nature of the borders, the porous borders that is bordering Uganda and South Sudan, even at the Kampala establishment, the national level, at the ministry level, Minister of Foreign Affairs, sometimes they might not pull initiatives that will actually intervene or curb migration movement that are taking place at these porous borders between Uganda and South Sudan. You can't pull that between Uganda and DRC because of the dynamics. You cannot also pull that between Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi. The same thing to Kenya, because there are two or three designated borders between Uganda and Kenya. But South Sudan has between 15 to 20 porous borders, and only about 6 or 7 are manned by security personnel, customs officials, and other regulators. But then the rest of the other porous borders, that's when, if there's insecurity in South Sudan, you find for them, they don't even mind about these international instruments. They just cross. Now, once they have crossed, they get integrated into the refugee settlements. Again, the same population that could have come maybe a month ago, if they feel that the security situation has calmed down, they would sneak through the porous borders to go back to South Sudan, either to get food or do farming. And again, that's subject them to abuses and other risk. So I would urge, in order for us to turn this academia kind of arrangement into real practical things, let's map initiatives, model initiatives in some of the countries or the continents or the regions, and then invest in a lot there, so that the stories, the hardcore evidence stories that come from there will actually inform the advocacy that we need at the global level. Yeah, that's maybe what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I think it's a very important element to bring to the table. What voices, what stories we are bringing to the discussion. And Patty, the floor is yours. We're going to be the last intervention of the day.
No, thank you. Well, just to maybe to join in from where Richard is starting from, and how do we really reflect real life activities, real life stories, real life initiatives out there that are actually, moving some of the mountains that we find very difficult in the global discourse. And I think the inspiration that I would like to just share from here is from the Africa group, and it will probably answer some of the questions that Dr. Raj has also asked in terms of how do we see that collective of ideas across spaces, and using Africa as an example. the Abuja Forum was really a thought of diaspora, civil society on the continent, and trade unions in realizing that we are often pulled into these meetings at different points, a little bit sometimes too late into the processes. And so we wanted to go ahead of the game and understanding how, well, first of all, trying to take the opportunity at that particular point that Senegal was also co-chair. So we thought that the summit would be, you know, half coming into the continent. But even without Senegal on board, I think what has been very critical from the civil society is for us to just move along with our own agenda. And thus you have the Abuja Forum that has been put in there. So I think that's already a demonstration, but I think we're not unique in that sense, because I think that there are a lot of other efforts that are happening in other spaces. And what needs to happen, particularly what's happening today here in this space with the PMC, is bringing these divergent thoughts together. So I think that the PMC is actually one of these spaces where we bring collective efforts, and we bring collective efforts because we are diverse in the subjects that we cover under migration governance, whether it's from the different perspectives, but also from the regions, and also that you've got a lot of intersections between, you know, from migration to health to children, women, and many other sectors, diaspora, and even with diaspora, there's a lot of diversity in there. So I think that the PMC is a great space for us to continue these kind of conversations. So we hope that in the next week, indeed, we would hear a little bit more into the context. And then I just wanted to zoom in a bit on the narratives. Indeed, the narratives, one of the things that we thought is very critical, and that's the point that was raised as a thematic expert on this group, that when you exclude a region, and to be very specific, the penholder had said, in response to the question, why is Africa and parts of Asia not included in the global narratives migration outlook that will come out of the GFMD? The response was that Africa is not excluded because it will be looked at as part of the region around the Mediterranean. Now, I've been African all my life, and I've never described myself as coming from a region somewhere around the Mediterranean. I come from a continent, and from a continent, I come from a country. So it was a very bizarre way of the description, but you know, this is a safe space, and I think it's very honest to say that then when we don't see that representation, and particularly for the points that Dr. Raj had raised, we just don't want to see narratives in a global north perspective and on a global north footprint. We want to see it on our various continents, because indeed there are a lot of different issues that you could bring up on the African continent, as you would in other spaces as well. So for us already, this was a way of saying, yes, there's an important, there will be a big gap in talking about global narratives if you miss out a region around the Mediterranean, others that would basically call it Africa. So if we were to do this, what are we doing to move forward? What we're doing to move forward, and what we're hoping to get through the Abuja Forum, is basically to go ahead and do the work that is going to miss. And I think that's also very important in the context of driving the agenda that we believe is important. So if it doesn't show up in the GFMD, we'll make it show up somewhere else. And I think also going forward, what is also important in terms of moving from just a line in the background paper, or just your region being explored and explained by a number of experts out there, is what do we see as some of those very important initiatives that we want to task ourselves to have taken forward in this year of focusing our energy, because we're focusing a lot of energy on the GFMD. So what kind of activities do we want to use the GFMD lens to focus our energy on? And that's part of the work that will go through the subgroups in the Africa group. There will be some activities where very concretely, what can we move forward? What can we show the GFMD, what the GFMD is not able to do? So I think in saying that, it's a co-creation space. And I think in using that opportunity, I think the PMC was also created in a way, not for us to just have dialogue, but for us to also raise up different campaigns, for us to talk about those actions that are happening and those initiatives. So when we go into global discourse, all of us in that sense, not just a few who are selected as thematic experts, or those who make it to New York, Geneva, and all the different centers around the world on the different things that we talk about, but all of us can feel confident in moving forward, that we have an understanding of what the people's migration challenge is as regards to the GFMP. So I think it's a call for a lot of us to take on that burden personally in your organizations on what you do, to bring those kind of issues, I think, to the PMC, because we would like to deliberate more on that and would like to be much more actionable than we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And I would like just to give one moment to the last hand, which is Brice Monou.
Oui, merci Elena. Moi, j'ai une question qui revient tout le temps.
Thank you very much, Elena. I have a question.
Nous, par exemple, en tant qu'experts, nous avons fait des propositions.
Which is that we have had suggestions about the diaspora as experts. We have been in more than one space since Abuja, Dakar, and we continue working, of course, in holding meetings with Paddy and with other officials in order to be capable as much as possible to have a wider perspective and a wider intake. However, the question that is often asked is what would be Asia's approach to the diaspora? How is it that we can know that we have evolved? What has evolved in Asia? We coming from the West, the diaspora from the West, how can we actually approach the situation? I believe that these are, of course, some crossed approaches that express how our entities, how our organizations have evolved. And when we say that we are vectors of change, then this is a matter of paramount importance. We have to say it out and loud, because otherwise we remain, as already said, and maybe I'm mistaken, we find ourselves speaking of what others do. However, we never say or do, and once again, I go back to the forum, we do not only represent Africa, we are for Africa, we are for the Caribbean, we are for Asia, we are for the Cambodia, for Vietnam, for other countries. However, we need actually to ask others. We need actually to engage with Latin America. In France, like elsewhere, we have to be very active. And my question is, when is it that we can actually engage in a conversation within ourselves without actually going into this categorization, without going into this sectioning of the diaspora? And we need as well to be capable of understanding what others are doing and what will be the strategy that we are implementing, what are the negotiations, what is the dialogue that needs to be implemented with the governments and with the civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Brice, because I think with that set of questions, it's a wonderful way for us to finish the discussion today. I think Patty and Brice, in a way, kind of set the agenda of what we hope to be then the next discussion, the discussion that we're going to have on the 30th of May in 2 weeks, that will allow us to continue reflecting precisely on what is our role, how do we put, how do we organize, how do we share views, and how do we become these vectors and these voices, not at this group somewhere from somewhere far, and as Patty was saying, invisible. But how do we become clear, strong voices, being able to present our ideas and our proposals? And I go back to Professor Binod's comments, holding those in positions of power accountable, and also thinking about what is implementable, what is feasible. Thank you, everyone who joined us today for this discussion. We're really encouraged in terms of how we can broaden this space, how this can be an inclusive space, and how the discussion can move forward. Thank you very much for participating today. This was another session of the PMC discussions, the John Kennedy Bingham Memorial Series. And in light of this series and of his spirit, let's continue the conversation going, and let's try to continue moving forward within the spaces. Thank you very much. Have a very good rest of the day or the evening. Thank you to all who participated today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you, Helena.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Elena.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.